cursor in the right place. Click it and there it goes.
Does he see you?
Yeah.
What? Are you making eye?
He's on the right thing, he just hasn't clicked it.
You don't have to be the world's fastest man to beat a speeding bullet. We can save our endangered animals. When we all come together,
we can do anything.
All right, that was to get your attention. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Mark Moore. I'm a program associate in the Asia Division. This program is co-sponsored by our China Environment Forum, led by Dr. Turner, who will be one of our speakers. And title is China's Green Olympics, The Lasting Impact. I'll just briefly sort of read their bios and many accomplishments, so you will be shocked and awed. Jennifer Turner is coordinator of our China Environment Program here and serves as the editor of the Wilson Center's journal, the China Environment Series. She's most recently published an article on the environmental movement in China in the State of the World 2006, published by the World Watch Institute. And if you're, worried because you speak Chinese and your Japanese is getting rusty, this is published both in English, Chinese, and Japanese. She is also co-authored the Wilson Center report on water challenges in China, titled Reaching Across the Water, International Cooperation Promoting Sustainable River Basin Governance in China. Dr. Turner received her PhD in Public Policy and Comparative Politics from Indiana University. And in case you didn't know, the president of the Wilson Center, Lee Hamilton, was the congressman from that district.
I didn't know him back then.
Yeah. Guanxi.
No
Guanxi.
Guanxi. No Guanxi.
Guanxi. We can translate that for those who don't understand. To my farther right is, to the left of Jennifer, is Jeff Fulgham, who was appointed Chief Marketing Officer of GE, General Electric Water and Processing Technologies, in 2006. Now, probably you didn't know that GE is involved in more than 335 projects related to the Beijing Olympic Games. Mr. Fulgham is directly involved in the GE project announced August 6th of this year to provide multiple technologies for China's first rainwater recycling system, which will be located at Beijing's National Stadium, the setting of the opening and closing ceremonies of the Beijing 2008 Olympic Games. Jeff is a graduate of Ohio State University with BS in Mechanical Engineering. To my immediate right is Peter Knights, who's the Executive Director of WildAid and responsible for that video. WildAid is an NGO dedicated to greatly reduce illegal wildlife trade, thereby allowing threatened species to recover to safe levels. In 1996, working across Asia, he created the Active Conservation Awareness Program. The program is currently focused on the 2008 Beijing Olympics and features Olympic gold medal winners from around the world, including China, carrying WildAid's message on reducing demand for endangered species products, such as shark fins. The program now reaches a worldwide audience with over 80 celebrity ambassadors, such as Jackie Chan and Yao Ming. Mr. Knights is a graduate of the London School of Economics with a BS in Economics. Okay, and without further ado, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon. I don't know if I can be as zingy as Maurice Green, fast as running after a bullet to save a tiger, but I will do my best. Welcome. I guess question with Maurice Green. A lot of the runners that are going to Beijing, there is a question whether or not for the long distance runners, whether or not their events may be postponed. Concerns about Beijing's air quality. In fact, back when Beijing bid for the 2000 Olympics, they lost that bid to Sydney because of air quality problems in China. Air quality problems, well, in Beijing and in China writ large. But notably, when they won the 2008 bid, it was in great part because of all of the environmental plans, very detailed, that they had in their bid. And so they beat out Toronto and Paris because of what was considered, what's called the green pillar. Since the Sydney Olympics, there is something in for all of your bids, you have to have a green pillar. And for most cities, it's just simply that how you will use sustainable materials in your venues and not generate more pollution in the city. But, you know, back in LA in 1984, they had to clean up. And the city also had to use a little bit of a heavy persuasion for industries and some of their people to drive their cars to make sure the air wasn't as bad. But Beijing's air is much worse than LA, and in fact that back even as they won the bid, they early 2001, they were still competing with Mexico City as being the most polluted capital in the world. Now today, I want to look at kind of where Beijing has come. I mean, we had a meeting back in 2001 with the Beijing Olympic Committee official coming and telling us of all the grand plans, and so I actually get to do opposite of what I usually do in China talks. Instead of a litany of woes, there's actually some litany of some good news in terms of what they have done for the Olympics. But as I worked with Asia Program in conceptualizing this, we were wondering, well, what are the longer term impacts? Will it just be clean air for 2 weeks in Beijing, or what goes beyond that? Well, Beijing, they don't want to be known as the smog Olympics. And so they have invested since 1998. They started even before they actually won the games, $12 billion in cleaning up mainly air, but also water and waste and greening, issues that have also been on the agenda. But air is the biggie. We do have Jeff here is going to talk a little bit more in detail about the water. I'm going to be your air person here today. The Blue Sky program for the Olympics has focused on auto industry and the power sectors, and they wanted to really move Beijing's air from grade 3, which is pretty nasty even by Chinese standards, to grade 2, which they consider healthy, which maybe, again, we're not comparing it with other countries. But they have said that since in 1999 there were 146 days in Beijing where you could see the blue sky. Now there are 241, which is pretty impressive. I mean, yeah, some people have been in Beijing, you kind of, but there are still a lot of days where you don't see the blue sky, and it's anything but. I mean, heavy smog. China, they measure their smog on a scale of 0 to 500, and LA Times had an article a couple weeks ago. They quoted a friend of mine, actually an NGO friend in Beijing, and said that, that last summer Beijing hit, 300 is kind of like maximum of what anything that you could conceptualize in the U.S. I mean, that's severely polluted. That's L.A. on really, really bad days. Last summer, Beijing hit 500. And they're like, but maybe it was beyond. The mercury on the thermometer broke. It doesn't go any higher than that. But still, that, they still have come a long way, that you're getting bluer skies, and, that they went from vastly exceeding World Health Organization standards on SO2, CO2, particulates. I mean, they exceeded it by 273% back in 1998. It's not quite as bad now, but again, it's the particulate matter and the smog that concern the International Olympic Committee, because you can't do a marathon. You just can't do a marathon with that kind of air. Now, the cleanup now. Let's be positive, because there are a lot of positive trends. I mean, even before the Olympics, and I think in some ways, gearing up in part, Beijing converted away from coal for heating to natural gas, and they've continued that, accelerated that since they got the bid. But unfortunately, while the air, when I did my dissertation work in China in 1994, I was amazed how much cleaner Beijing's air was. It started going downhill after that, in great part because of cars. Beijing adds 1,000 cars to its road every day. So today there's approximately 3 million cars on the street, also known as the parking lot. But what I was impressed, what I've been impressed with looking at it from the policy side, is that Beijing Environmental Protection Bureau has really used the Olympics to flex their muscles a bit more. Their auto emission standards are much stricter than the national standards, and so the Municipal Environmental Protection Bureau can restrict what kinds of cars are actually sold or driven in Beijing. Converting taxis and buses. 33,000 taxis and buses have already been replaced by newer and cleaner vehicles. They have pilot electric bus and fuel cell projects. I mean, there's like 14 electric buses that are doing one route in Beijing, and even though electricity still burns coal, that it's not quite as polluting as if you simply have a fossil fuel-based car. There are other battery ones. Fuel cell cars, the Global Environment Fund and the UNDP have been supporting an experimental project that's going to be having some fuel cell cars. A lot of these pilots are actually within the Olympic Village or just around it, getting people there. And it's seen not only as promoting clean energy, I mean, it's promoting the technology. Because, I mean, they want to sell things. Some companies want to sell things in China, we've heard. But that this is using the Olympics as a platform to promote these clean products. And notably, Daimler Chrysler donated 3 demo fuel cell passenger cars for one of the initiatives here. So as they're getting closer to the Olympic events, that they are, we believe, getting close to their goal of having 80% of the buses and 70% of the taxis be clean, that does have a lasting impact on the city. They can't go back. Transportation grid, there's going to be 4 light rail routes, which will be completed in 2008. And, but also in terms of power generation. I mean, the Olympic facility, this is where it's more like standard for what you're going to see in any city that puts on the Olympics, that the actual facilities are using renewable energy. And the 7 main stadiums in Beijing are equipped with solar generators. 90% of the lighting outside the stadiums and the hot water supply in the Olympics Village is powered by solar energy. A little side note, did you know that China was the leading producer and consumer of small solar hot water heaters? Acknowledgement of, no? Didn't know? They're stunned in silence out there. They didn't know that. But, it's an interesting fact that this is a good example of China using green technology to really develop a market. I mean, I think that, they're the #1 seller around the world in this technology. Beijing will have its first wind power plant by the end of this year that's going to supply the main stadiums. Industries, the big stories that we've often heard is that China, they've pretty much closed, they'd planned to close or retrofit about 200 extremely dirty factories in Beijing. And the biggest and most significant was in 2005 when they closed Capital Iron and Steel Group, which was in northern Beijing. And I don't know if any of you ever saw this area. Very toxic. And anecdotal evidence says that cancer rates in the area, just obviously respiratory illnesses were quite high in this part of Beijing. And so of anything in terms of long-term impact in Beijing, that factory is gone. Now what's notable is that you could say that they're just moving them further out. And it's true, some of the dirty industries probably move further out. But since China was granted the Olympics, they have much stricter and difficulty sometimes enforcing, but much stricter regulations on environmental impact assessments. And a little bit awareness has been raised, so sometimes it is going to be more difficult to actually rebuild anywhere near Beijing, in particular, an extremely dirty factory. But do keep in mind, though, that while the Olympics has stimulated these kinds of pilot projects and clean buildings, that this is all just part of what is a bigger trend in China on more progressive energy and air pollution laws. Because, it's not just for the Olympics that they're doing this. China has passed fuel efficiency standards that if they're fully implemented this year, notably they had it to be implemented by the end of 2007. Again, a little bit of an eye towards the Olympic. 90% of U.S. SUVs will not meet Chinese standards. They have a renewable energy law that by 2010 will demand that 10% of China's energy comes from renewable sources. Again, they're trying to be very technology pushing in many ways to create incentives. Now, there's also the question of, I get interviewed a lot by journalists saying, well, again, can the Olympic athletes, will they be able to breathe? Will the air be clean? And I'm in D.C., but I've said for many years that China, that if push comes to shove, they will use environmental authoritarianism, and they will just shut things down. But in the last few weeks, it's very intriguing, we're seeing reports that Beijing is saying, well, no, we're not. We're actually more interested in really pushing the implementation of long-term measures. So that they're not going to shut things down. Now, it's possible that some factories have told them, we're not going to shut down our businesses, for 2 weeks, because they were going to shut down companies producing all around the region, because, air blows into Beijing. Same thing with the cars. They had a test of a don't drive your car to work day, a weekend in Beijing, and it's kind of mixed reviews. The air was evidently 20% better than usual, which is kind of good. But a lot of onlookers, again, it's all very anecdotal, saying that, well, not a lot of people really paid heed to this. So, but there's a chance that what they will end up doing is just get, I guess, well, just 1.3 million cars off the road. I guess that's not too bad, but whether or not that will be enough is unclear. And as I noted before, the IOC has already said that they are ready now to postpone the marathon and any kind of endurance activities at the Olympics. Now, I don't want to step on Jeff's toes, but just to say a couple things about water, because in urban areas in China, 90% of groundwater is polluted, and this is overall in the country, about 70% of surface water, you shouldn't fish in it and you shouldn't drink it. And nationwide, I mean, the water is black in many rivers, so you see my point. Big source of the problem is the lack of municipal wastewater treatment. Nationwide, there are about 30% of wastewater is treated. Now, Beijing, we think, and I was debating with Jeff beforehand, I'm like, do you really know? And going back and forth. The goal is for Beijing to become 90%, is to treat 90% of their water. They're at 70% right now, we think. But even if they don't make the high goal of 90%, which probably was a wee bit unrealistic, the fact that if Beijing reaches 70%, that is by far the highest of wastewater treatment in a city. And also kind of looking at it more holistically, a comprehensive approach to treating their water. And it's something that I haven't really seen in any city in China to this date. So you could say that, you could kind of hold up Beijing maybe as a little poster child for clean water. I don't know. But where there is a kind of a missed opportunity on the Olympics has been, I think, in the issue of water conservation. I mean, there is really a fascinating little project that Coca-Cola has been doing called Save a Barrel of Water. It's a community environmental program to encourage children to save fresh water and recycle water within their families. And Coca-Cola also has a similar initiative focused on university students, and that's good. But I do want to note that within a month of Beijing, maybe it was even within a week of Beijing being granted the Olympics, they passed a decision that had been debated for decades, namely to construct the Southwater Northward Project, which is 3 massive canals from the Yangtze River bringing water to the dry north. Because, saying that, we really can't, Beijing cannot be dry in 2008. Now, it's not just for the Olympics. This is a long-term concern, but still it's, in terms of like the environmental governance, infrastructure, and thinking in China, it's still very much a supply-side management. We will supply the water. And the project itself, when it was approved, went through quite quickly, no debate. But I believe, though, that there have been changes in the last couple of years in China in terms of environmental protection. It's become a much, much higher priority. I think the Olympics has helped a bit. But that now they have rules on environmental impact assessments that require public hearings. And most notably, and I do believe that somehow this is a bit linked to the Olympics, that the first 2 major public hearings on environmental projects happened in Beijing, one of which was linked to a high-power energy supply project for the Olympic Village. Now, in the end, the projects both moved forward, but for those of you in the audience who are China environment watchers, okay, we're nerdy. We got goosebumps and we're very excited. The idea of having public participation in environmental decision-making in China is significant in our eyes. A couple last comments. Just today, got a news story, hot flash. Green and Olympic next step is also taxis in China, no smoking is allowed. Okay? Just so you know, that is an indoor air pollution problem. Starts next week, so if you were thinking of lighting up in a Chinese taxi in Beijing next week, don't. Longer-term accomplishments that I will highlight and we can talk about in the Q&A. One that isn't talked about is actually what I think is the most significant, which is why I'm mentioning it, health benefits. There's actually a study that I'm reviewing that will hopefully be published in some other journal soon that it talks about, they've done a study. This is the second study that I know of that's really looking at what's happened over the past 10 years in terms of how many lives are saved. And you may think this is an esoteric exercise, but reports are showing from the OECD and the World Bank that like 650 to 750,000 people die early in China from respiratory illnesses alone, 61,000 from dirty water. OECD says by 2020, health problems from air alone will cost China 13% of their GDP. So this is not just an academic exercise of researchers kind of figuring out, well, so the air is so much cleaner. How many fewer people are going to die? And, there's some, you got numbers that from deaths linked to SO2, that it's a good chance that over the decade, 40,000 fewer people died in Beijing. 15,000 deaths were avoided from particulates in Beijing over the last 10 years. And what also I think is important, though, is that these kind of studies are being publicized, raising awareness. And that is something, too, that I think is one of the keys of the Green Olympics, is that the public not only seeing blue skies, it could be very addicting. You might want to see those blue skies longer. People from all over China coming to see this. But too, that the message, it's been a major propaganda slogan since 2001. And so I think that when you see that kind of slogan and agenda being raised, jointly with a lot of stronger environmental laws, China's Environmental Protection Bureau flexing its muscles, it could have an impact. I can't tell you how much. Stay tuned. Corporate involvement, I think, is also kind of a long-term impact. The moment we have GE coming to talk, Coca-Cola announced last week that for all of the Olympic venues in the 7 cities, that all of their, and don't just poo-poo this, all of their coolers and vending machines will feature hydrofluorocarbon-free insulation, and they will be highly energy efficient. And they've actually partnered with, they started with Greenpeace back at the Sydney Olympics to try to clean up their ecological impact, their CO2 emission impact from the actual Coca-Cola coolers. But this is the first time they're doing it 100%. And as we joked ahead of time, well, I guess they'll probably leave those machines there, a lasting impact of those, but also the idea that this is also raising the bar. And Coca-Cola has a big presence in China in pushing also their net zero water loss. So that's good too. Last comment. NGO involvement. To be honest, with the present company accepted, of course, with WildAid, I've been a little bit disappointed in how the NGO community, both the international and the Chinese, haven't seemed to have really been doing as much with the Olympics as I thought they might. We do see a lot of international groups. There are about 50 groups that have been operating in China for some of them up to a decade, 2 decades. And I think they sometimes have just added the Green Olympic. It's a good slogan to add and that, what you're doing. But to have specific projects around the Olympics, I haven't seen as much. Environmental Defense has one where they have this green commuting initiative, working with government agencies, businesses, and news media organizations to try to find ways to encourage people to, carpool or use public transport. But the Chinese groups, two Chinese NGOs, the 2 first Chinese green groups, Global Village Beijing and Friends of Nature, were on the bid committee. And afterwards, they and 18 others were put on part of the Olympic Committee Advisory Board. But I chatted with Elizabeth Economy about this as well, and we kind of are feeling that they haven't really been pulled into the involvement of the games per se. And I think that Peter will probably talk about that there are difficulties in doing that. It's a big event, and in all honesty, the Beijing Olympic Committee wanted to make sure that those stadiums were built, that they had other priorities. And so, in terms of China trying to be a green Olympic, if you compare it to previous ones, they've gotten the message out there. But last comment, though, is that, I don't think it's a proper yardstick to say how it has necessarily greened China overall. Because ultimately, some of the fundamental governance issues in China with the environment, the strong power of local governments who, they're the ones that don't obey environmental laws, that hasn't been changed by the Olympics. But I do see kind of a really good demonstration effect. And on that note, I'm off the stage.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to kind of pick up where Jennifer left off a bit on the positive side. I see tremendous improvement. My first trip to China, I think, was about 7 or 8 years ago. And the improvement, not just around Beijing and the Olympics, but what we see throughout the country are sustainable, truly changes in behavior that are lasting. And I want to touch on some of those as we see from the General Electric company. I'm going to talk a little bit about the big GE, some of the things we're doing around air and a lot of other issues, and then specifically about water, which is the business of which I'm part of. So let me touch on some of these issues. Just kind of as a setup, we follow a lot of megatrends in our business that are driving behavior. And in particular, we look at 6 major trends, and all of these have a influence or are influenced by China. Water scarcity is an issue around the world. A lot of people aren't aware of the impacts because we don't see it here, sitting in D.C. or in most of the United States. But 1 billion people today do not have access to fresh water, and that'll grow to 3 billion if we don't do something about it by 2025. So we have an opportunity to change that future. If you look at waterborne illness, Jennifer mentioned some of the statistics that China's seeing, but globally, 6,600 people a day are dying due to waterborne illness. And most of those are children, and most of those deaths are occurring in places that cannot afford to do something about it. So we have to. We look at the developing nations, the growth that is occurring. Most of the growth is occurring in areas of water scarcity, including China, India, Middle East, Eastern Europe. A lot of the growth that we see overlaps with where real water issues are there. Rising energy costs, this imbalance between energy supply and demand, is bad today and only getting worse. China is going to build 500 new power plants in the next 5 years to meet their rising energy demand. There's an opportunity to do it differently. Rather than traditional coal-fired power plants, let's look at new technologies. Not only biofuels, solar, wind, other things, but even being able to convert coal into cleaner burning fuel, syngas and other things. We'll talk about some of those technologies in just a moment. So we have a chance to make a difference and take these mega trends kind of head on. More stringent regulations. This is a place where regulation's good. You know, a lot of people say more regulation bad, but it's actually a good thing here in that it drives the right behavior. So cracking down on particulate matter in the air and metals in the discharge, those kind of things that we are seeing, China is actually getting ahead of the curve. Instead of being just reactive or only doing what's good enough, a lot of the new regulatory environment is driving ahead of where we are here in the States or even in Western Europe, which is generally ahead of us in a lot of water discharge regulation. The good news also is enforcement is here. If I were to say that 10 years ago, great regulatory environment, but not much ability to enforce. Now enforcement is here. We're seeing the demand for siting of new manufacturing plants are requiring water reuse and are requiring a very different footprint than what was present 5 or 10 years ago. And then finally, this infrastructure, not just in China, but everywhere. Huge investments in infrastructure and rail that you think about. Transportation in India and China and other places around the world, tremendous investment. Even here in the U.S., and you look at places like the oil sands area of Alberta, British Columbia, those that are familiar with the growth that's going up in that area of Canada. Tremendous investments in infrastructure, which is doing some weird things. You look at the fallout on steel price and demand for materials of construction, things that are happening around the world. So we track a lot of these trends and look at what impact is that going to have. So we'll touch on some of these, the impact and how we're trying to address some of these trends and change them for the positive. Just real briefly, those that aren't familiar with our water business, relatively new to GE. It's actually been over the last 8 years that General Electric has made 5 major acquisitions and compiled a new water and process technology business. And we kind of do everything from sea to shining sea, as it were. We kind of we have a lot of desalination solutions where we'll produce new source water where that's necessary. We try to look at that as a last alternative. We'd much rather help our industrial and municipal customers look at how do I reduce the amount of water consumed, how do I reuse, recover, do other things before we produce a new source water, but that is certainly an option is desal. We treat major industrial customers around the world on almost every industry, from refining, petrochemical, steel, food, beverage, everything, from river to try to help them utilize source water more efficiently, clean up their effluent and meet the changing demands and really everything involved in between. So a lot of areas that we play within the industrial and municipal space. In China, GE's been involved in China. We just kind of celebrated our 100th year in China last year, and certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, the growth has accelerated dramatically. We now have essentially every business within GE has a pretty significant presence in China. We do about $7 billion a year in China, so we are a major company in China and have about 14,000 to 15,000 employees in China today and growing rapidly. So indeed, it is an opportunity of tremendous growth for us, which is one of the reasons that we took on the challenge of becoming an Olympic partner and saw this as a tremendous opportunity to help China achieve their goals. Touch a little bit on some of the water issues in China. The graph on the left, you'll see, refers to both the north and the south, the challenges that we have from the major rivers. If you look at the combination of the blue bars and the kind of tannish colored bars there, and up to the white, in other words, about 90+% of the rivers in the north are below a grade that is deemed unsuitable for human contact, so unable to sustain marine life. Very, very challenging waters in the north. And in the south, it's better, but certainly not up to world standards. So it's a real challenge to change this overnight, and we're not going to be able to see instantaneous change, but there's tremendous improvement. In the last 5 to 10 years, we're seeing a stop in the decline, and now, indeed, we're seeing a watershed approach, a much broader approach to cleaning up this situation. And some of the data, again, you'll see there that a significant amount of China faces severe water shortages, that there's a combination of water scarcity and water pollution are really what's facing China today. Other parts of the world are facing one or the other, bits and pieces, but China is looking head on at a tremendous increase in demand on fresh water and a diminishing supply. So it's not an option to not do something, if that makes sense. So again, we're working in many areas of China to try to turn this around. Jennifer mentioned earlier about in 1994, the IOC added a third pillar to the Olympics. In addition to sport and culture, the pillar of environment was added, and so that every city that takes on the Olympic challenge has a responsibility to not just clean up their act for the Olympics, but indeed to make that a sustainable change. And we've seen those changes in the cities that have hosted the Olympics over the last, probably since Los Angeles, since the '84 games anyway. We're seeing that sustainability, and I think China is only going to, probably has the greatest challenge, but also is really stepping up to that challenge. And we'll hit on some of those things that we see. The stadium itself, we have several projects that are directly involved just in the water business. Jennifer mentioned we have this recycling project that produces about 100 tons of rainwater an hour. It's collected in underground pools and then used for landscape. It's gray water use, if you will, everything except drinking water, for landscape, for flush water, for other gray water uses. The drinking water itself of the National Stadium is also run through our reverse osmosis systems to provide pure drinking water for the stadium, equivalent to about 500,000 bottles of water a day, but try to avoid the bottles and take it right from tap to lips. How's that? So a lot of projects. And throughout GE, we've got a lot of other projects going on in the stadium, and depending on time, I'll show you a brief video that shows some of the other activities. Actually, an updated picture, because if you haven't seen the stadium up close, it is a phenomenal work of art. It's an unbelievable architectural piece. Okay. So we've got one from about a month ago to kind of show where we are as of today. But throughout GE, the energy delivery systems for the stadium, the energy transportation distribution, security systems, baggage handling systems at the new airport structure. There's all kind of projects going on around the Olympics that GE is involved with kind of from throughout. So some pretty neat stuff there. The green itself, which contains the stadium, the natatorium, and many of the other facilities. We're doing a lot of things on energy-efficient turbines, biogas turbines, for heating and cooling of the green area. And again, landscaping is provided by the rainwater systems and other water reuse systems. Just little things. I was just kind of picking up some other just kind of bits and pieces because we see this infrastructure rebuild happening, again, in a long-term investment. We have GE Jenbacher. Jenbacher is a multi-fueled engine that burns biogas, a lot of low-grade fuels, very clean and efficient units. So we see these Jenbachers being used all over the place, even as backup power in hotels and hospitals and the stadium and everywhere. So again, this is not necessarily a cheap short-term solution. These are long-term investments to improve overall the sustainability of clean air and clean water. The water reuse is another, as I mentioned earlier, the solution we feel, one of the major solutions for water scarcity around the world is water reuse. It isn't necessarily to create new source water. Certainly we can reduce the amount of water used, we can create new, but water reuse is a very affordable and doable technology today. In Australia, for instance, the watersheds around Sydney are down to about 28% of full pool, and yet they still they discharge about 30% of the clean water they produce for the city of Sydney, use it once and dump it right back out to the sea again. It's a very inefficient way that water is being used. So we're looking at new ways to be able to clean that water up and reuse it for irrigation, a lot of other things. People don't realize a golf course uses 500,000 gallons of water a day, and we're citing 14,000 new golf courses in 2008. We as a world, 14,000 golf courses, 500,000 gallons a day. If you go do the math, that's a lot of fresh water being dumped on the grass. we can use effluent from a municipal wastewater treatment plant very efficiently to clean that up and use it for irrigation for things like golf courses, rainwater collection. So there's a lot better ways to use our precious water and free up that fresh water for human consumption. So water reuse is being adapted in many areas of the Olympics. Again, this is a sustainable solution, not a short-term fix. The easy way to do it here is just take some river water, clean it up a little bit, and drink it and be done with it. But this is a long-term solution to the issue, not a short-term. So these are all, to me, very positive. If you expand your horizon a little bit, look outside of Beijing. Look at what's going on around China. I just brought up a couple of projects here that I think are pretty exciting. One of the solutions to water pollution is to discharge nothing, zero liquid discharge, which is this ZLD idea. It's been used throughout the world for the last 20 years or so. There's about 17 power plants in Arizona, for instance, that use zero liquid discharge. If you think about, they're using less water on the inlet, reuse it, clean it up, continue to reuse that water, and at the end you're left with a small amount of water, and they actually evaporate that and crystallize that water so that is essentially zero water is discharged back to the environment again. So it's the most efficient use of water. Now the flip side is it is energy intensive to be able to do ZLD. So it isn't a solution everywhere, but where we can't meet the discharge water requirements, and you can balance the energy demand with ZLD systems, it's a great way to go. So the fact that in China we are seeing a tremendous demand for zero liquid discharge is a good sign. This is progressive industry taking a strong move to eliminate the negative discharge back to their surface waters. Another project we have is around rural villages. Tremendous need for drinking water in rural villages, and they do not have the resources to be able to have clean water and pure water systems. So this is where a lot of the disease is occurring. This is the same in China. In India, there's 600 small villages in India with similar situation. So what we're doing, actually piloting a program in China as part of the Olympics, in that we have mobile water systems that essentially is a drinking water, a 600-gallon-a-minute drinking water plant enclosed in a tractor-trailer rig or a container, and that can be moved around very easily. We've got about 800 of these units around the world now producing water, and what we're doing in China is putting in a capacity, a tank with enough capacity to provide a village with, say, a month of drinking water supply. And then we can take our mobile units village to village and fill these tanks, in a less than a day. You can provide a month's supply of drinking water for a village and go to the next village, and kind of this milk run idea. It has a great financial payback to the government. It's very inexpensive to produce high purity drinking water for these villages, and the payback is in, Jennifer touched on it earlier, it's healthcare costs. It's overall sustainability of their population. So it's exciting where that we see that going. And then the last is a lot of these river to river, true to looking at total solution. How do I reduce my intake all the way through to the discharge, or river to river, so that we don't have continuing situation like you'll see an aerial view of the Yellow River there in pretty rough shape. So there's projects that we see throughout the country that are, I think, driven. The visibility of the Olympic Games is driving the right behaviors. And the other thing that we see the Olympic Games is providing visibility to best available technology, that other villages, other cities are seeing what is possible and driving the right behaviors, so that the kind of local and national level politics are having to follow suit. So as far as sustaining, I was just kind of thinking a few ideas from last trip of how do we continue to sustain this. One thing that companies like GE need to continue to do, and that's localize. We have to bring world health standards, if you will, do new ways of showing how we can manufacture locally. How can you have a smaller footprint? How can you change the way you manufacture locally and show a path to a cleaner world, both from a water and air standpoint? Improvements we're bringing to operating plants. For instance, the steel industry is absolutely booming right now in China. But right now they use about 10 times more water to produce a ton of steel than we do here in the U.S. So while we see that growth in the steel industry, we need to make sure that industry is growing efficiently. So we need to bring these best practices into the China steel industry, for example, and continue to drive the right behaviors. A lot of this is education at literally the elementary school level and on up, so that we can continue to have a next generation of folks that truly care. And so they're truly driving change. So we continue to look at education. Third week of October, we're going to have about 100 folks together through the NDRC in China, bringing together thought leaders throughout China, combined with actually Washington, with folks from Canada, from the EU, and throughout Asia, all coming together to talk about what is what do the next 20 years look like in China, and how do we drive the right legislative behavior? So there's a lot of things that we're doing to continue to try to make sure that this is sustainable. And a company with the breadth of GE can kind of point the direction, point the way, I think, and have some lasting impact, in addition to the green development and the other things that we're seeing. The other, I guess, the bottom line for us is and Jeff Immelt, our CEO, continues to reinforce that green truly can be green. Doing the right thing for the environment drives economic and very profitable growth for our business. So that's a good thing. And when you get that out there, I mean, it's like, why not? It's a beautiful thing when you can make money and do the right thing for the world. So that's very positive. Just a few other little things that we, outside of the water business, we see going on. The Evolution locomotive, which is a very energy-efficient locomotive, it's about 28% more efficient than the locomotives that it replaced. China's already ordered 300 locomotives. In fact, we've got a back order through the end of 2008 on our large locomotives. These are also capable of handling very large loads and go very long distances, which we need in China. China's infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, needs a tremendous amount of investment. So the good news here is they're buying the right long-term solution, a much more energy-efficient unit and a much lower carbon footprint through locomotives. Same thing with clean coal technology. This integrated gas combined cycle units convert coal into a clean-burning syngas, and is a much cleaner way to produce energy from coal without burning the coal itself. Gen X aircraft engines are the engine that's being used on the new Boeing 787, the 747-3, Airbus 380. A lot of the major new aircraft that's being built all have the GE Gen X engine on them. 30% or 15% more energy efficient and 30% quieter than the engines that it's replacing. So we're seeing tremendous investment from China in technologies like these. Again, very long-term investments, not short-term price, but long-term thoughtful investment. And many other things that we see, everything from as simple as compact fluorescent bulbs being instead of incandescent bulbs. Tremendous improvement overall in the energy footprint. So a lot of great investment that we see. Mentioned just briefly, we'll talk more about, I'm sure, about public policy, but we continue to get involved any way that we can to help drive the right legislation and regulatory environment and funding, both third-party external funding as well as government and companies like ours in order to drive the right behaviors. So that's kind of the GE story. Okay?
That's good.
Thank you.
So I think we'll take some questions a bit later, but thank you for your time.
Okay. Now I think we go to the guy that's going to make us look not so snazzy.
Move out of the way.
Thank you very much.
Listen up. These guys out there are killing you, and they gonna keep coming at you with everything they got. You gotta pick up your defense. Get tougher, get faster, work together, or you're dead. Any questions?
We can't teach defense to endangered animals, but we can defend them, support conservation, and we can stop the illegal wildlife trade.
When we all come together, we can do anything.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter Knights. I'm the Executive Director of WildAid, and we're an organization started off being a conservation organization, and I think have evolved, if anything, in becoming a communications organization. We really believe that the key to a lot of issues is public awareness, policymaker awareness, and education, and that's what we're engaged in. And since 2003, we've been working very specifically on the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which we see as an incredible strategic opportunity to raise the profile of a number of different environmental issues. Part of what's been going on in wildlife conservation is we used to have a scenario where we're really obsessed with saving habitat and protecting it, setting up national parks. Now what we've found is we have those national parks and the animals are getting ripped out of them. So, you know, a lot of places now, things like tigers are being raided from the national parks, elephants and poaching, so that some of the emphasis now is shifted towards the basically stopping the wildlife trade, because in reality we'll end up with a syndrome known as empty forests if we don't carry on like that. The illegal wildlife trade is a global problem. It features in every single country around the world pretty much. There's wildlife poaching, there's some type of illegal wildlife consumption. And the industry overall now is reckoned to be between 10 and 20 billion US dollars. And that sounds like an awful lot, but when you consider that fish and also trees are very often wildlife, that tells you why it's such an important problem now. I originally studied economics, and looking at the stuff I've done over the years, which is looking at really poaching epidemics, poaching crises like the black rhino declining from 60,000 to 2,500 over 10 years, the African elephants being halved in the 70s and 80s, and most latterly what's happening to the shark populations of the world. Every time you see that rapid decline, you see a rapid increase in the economy of the consuming countries. So in the case of the rhinos, it was both the Asian economies growing, but also Yemeni workers getting more money from Saudi oil fields, and that led to the ability to buy daggers. And so I look at these things always from the point of view of economics rather than biology. So it won't come as a big shock to you then that given the fantastic growth of the economy in China, the issues of illegal wildlife consumption have also been rising. And you could probably do a curve for the growth of the economy and match it with the growth of, say, the consumption of something like shark fin soup. It's a whole range of species that are involved, everything from tigers for their bones, for traditional medicine, rhinos for rhino horn, elephants for ivory, bears for their gallbladders and paws, monkeys sometimes for consumption as meat, pangolins, which are little Asian anteaters, which are consumed for food, and a whole range of different species. And to give you some idea of the scale, after the SARS outbreak, where civet cats were seen as a vector for disease, the Chinese government claims to have confiscated 980,000 wild animals in raids after that. Now, the reason we're focusing on China and on the consumption end of things, if you want to protect the wildlife out there, it's obviously spread all over the world, and many nations of the world have inadequate protection, inadequate anti-poaching. So there's a vast array of countries you'd have to work in to do it there. If you looked at the trade issues, it would be less countries, but still a large number. And then when you come down to the consumption side of things, there are some major players out there. These are just estimates that I put out there, but I think they're fairly fair indications. China is, I'd say, by far and away the largest consumer of illegal wildlife products. State Department says the United States is second. And the European Union, when it counted together, would probably be second, but as individual countries, it's probably less. So by working in China, you can tackle a large percentage of the illegal wildlife trade. We also look at the situation of supply and demand, and I draw analogies sometimes with the drugs trade to this, is we can really spend as much money as we want in enforcement, we can spend as much money napalming coca fields if that's what we want to do, but the reality is, while people are still prepared to pay a large amount of money to consume drugs, the trade will go on. So the fundamental drive behind this is the consumption. We've done a survey in China at the end of last year to look at what was being consumed. This also gives us the ability to measure the effects of our campaign at the end of it. We did 24,000 people in 16 cities throughout China, so we feel it's a pretty good sample. 80 species were in trade. 28.3% of people had eaten wildlife within the last year. And what was interesting, in most countries around the world, as affluence increases, so the consumption of wildlife goes down and people have domesticated animals that they're eating. In China, in actual fact, in some places it's gone up. And particularly in southern China, this is an issue where wildlife consumption is much more prevalent. Some of the reasons, we looked at some of the reasons people were eating it, ironically for health. After the SARS outbreak, people did learn a little bit, and we think there's been a consumption reductions, but they obviously haven't learnt enough. And social status is also interesting. Some of these wildlife product meals are extremely expensive, and in many cases they're purchased as a way of giving face, showing that you respect your guests and things like that. So it's very much a prestige element, and that to me suggests it's actually vulnerable to being reduced. We also did some very specific work on shark fin soup, which the slaughter of sharks worldwide now is probably the largest mass-scale slaughter of large animals in the world. And people need to think about sharks more like as lions and tigers of the sea rather than fish. They're not typical fish. They don't reproduce in the same way. They're top predators. They're very vulnerable to overexploitation. And I've been all over the world and seen graphic examples of just how far the demand for shark fin is outstripping the supply. In Australia, last year they seized 365 Indonesian fishing boats fishing illegally in Australia, one a day. In the Galapagos Islands where we work, we've had seizures of up to 10,000 shark fins. That represents 2,500 sharks. So there's a huge suck on sharks right now. And one of the other things that's interesting about the wildlife trade is the lack of knowledge of people that are consuming these things. So 76.3% of people didn't know that shark fin soup comes from sharks. Now, that sounds crazy, but in Chinese, it's called fish fin soup. So there's nothing to suggest it's necessarily from a shark. So basic levels of knowledge, which we see part of our thing is just raising awareness and education about what's going on. In many cases, when people understand what's going on, they can take the appropriate action. We've been lucky enough to enjoy very great support from the Chinese government on this project, partly because many of these species are protected and so it's fully in line with Chinese laws. They have had some good law enforcement efforts, but there hasn't been much public education. So, for example, in 1993 they banned the tiger bone and rhino horn trade, but there wasn't really anybody saying, well, this is why we're banning it and this is why we have to do it. So the education side hasn't really kept up. There is growing public interest. I've been told by some people that some of the National Geographic and Discovery Channel DVDs are actually more popular in the black market than things like the Hollywood movies. And then recently China took a unilateral step without really much announcement or anything like that. It banned the trade in the pangolins, those little anteaters I was talking about, and also snakes, eating snakes. And those are both massive trades in southern China. They've had container loads of snakes that have been seized, with thousands of snakes. So that was a very positive step they took with really little fanfare and little being mentioned. On the other hand, the illegal trade is vast. It's all over China, and it's pretty amazing when things like the turtles and snakes, the numbers involved are just phenomenal. In regards to shark fin, there is an influence of the shark fin trade, and they've been a little bit more wary about doing anything for sharks, even though probably about 90% of the shark fin trade, and we're talking 40 million sharks a year used for fin soup, is in China. Part of the problem with that is the international community has not protected many sharks, and part of the problem with that is they won't do it until it's proven that they're endangered, and we don't have data on most sharks on how many there were, let alone how many there are, so it's very difficult to get them on the protected list. One other negative that's come up recently is China's talking about opening tiger farms in China, and given the fact there's 3,000 wild tigers left now, I think pretty much every conservation organization in the world and the United Nations CITES agreement has recently totally condemned this as might be the last step for the tiger. So that's a very negative right now.
大家好，我是陈龙。我发现很多可爱的动物在大草原上走来走去，但是我就不了解为什么有这么多人去杀它们。人类为了吸。
Oh, sorry. I should probably just translate this. This, of course, is Jackie Chan. This is the first message we did in 1996. And basically what it's saying, the elephant is killed for its ivory, the bears are killed for their gallbladders, the turtles are killed for their shell. Please help me to help the animals, don't buy endangered species products. And a lot of times when this was put out there, it was the first time, I think, for many people to make a connection between the product they see on the shelf and the animal that's being killed in the field. And certainly Jackie himself said when he saw the footage he was appalled by it, and we must get it out there, people must understand and must know. If you look at like turtle shell jewelry, for example, it's a way removed from an actual turtle.
记住，没有买卖，就没有杀害。谢谢大家。
Jackie's done about 4 or 5 messages since then. So that was 1996, and we were doing investigations of illegal wildlife trade, finding it was all over the place, but people didn't know. I had rhino horn dealers who were saying, well, you know, a rhino's died, someone picks up the rhino horn and I buy it, what harm am I doing? And then you're saying, well, no, actually those rhinos have 24-hour protection, people are literally being killed over this rhino horn, and basically by you buying that, you're driving this trade. It really was, I think, for many people, sort of, oh boy, a conversion, if you like, at least. We decided what we had to do is try and raise awareness dramatically. We're a tiny organization. Although these things look very fancy, we pay about 5% of the costs for this. So how can a tiny organization try and influence 2 billion people? Well, we tried to do it through the way perhaps GE might try and do something. We tried to use advertising techniques from the most sophisticated companies. J. Walter Thompson in this case helped us. We tried to use perhaps the best spokespeople we could find to represent the campaign from all over the world, but predominantly from China and from Asia. We managed to team up with the Discovery Channel in Asia, and we produced a whole series of PSAs with different styles. You and I can help
to protect them from disappearing from this world.
So help us help them live as long as we do.
虽然鲨鱼不是人类，但是它们的生命一样的珍贵，应该受尊重。
请记住，没有买卖就没有杀害。
只要减少使用木制品或纸制品，您就能够帮助熊猫。
请及时拯救这些陆龟。
同心协力，我们可以做到一切。
携手同心，
无限生机。
When the buying stops, the killing can too.
It's up to us. Together we can save our endangered animals.
When we all come together, we can do anything. If our athletes face the kind of hurdles our endangered animals face, the finish line would come all too soon.
Help put an end to the illegal wildlife trade before it's too late.
When we all come together,
we can do anything.
We all come together, we can do anything.
When the buying stops, the killing can too.
For when the buying stops, the killing can too.
Let you and I pledge.
When the buying stops, the killing can too.
So you may recognize some of those faces, may not some of the others, but we really now almost have a roster of, we have 80 people. It's a sort of almost a who's who of Chinese celebrities. We're starting to build a who's who of Olympic athletes. And then also we have a good representation from Bollywood, the Indian cricket team, and people like that. So part of that has enabled us two things, the fantastic cast list, plus very high production values, and some of those ads, as you can see, look like the Nike ads or something like that. They look totally professionally produced, have enabled us to build up a massive footprint worldwide. And some of you may have seen these possibly on CNN International. But the biggest ones, the biggest partners we've had are CCTV in China. And some of these messages have gone out after the 7 o'clock news on CCTV1, which is the main national station which goes all over China, and also Doordarshan in India, which again pretty much covers the whole country with absolutely massive footprints. And because we've been able to do this whole series of them, it's not just a one-off hit. They'll play Yao Ming for 3 months or so, and then they'll have another star to put on. So through this two techniques of having very high production values and having real top stars, and then a whole series of these things, we've managed to build up a massive distribution network where sometimes in a week we think we reach 1 billion people. So the 2008 Olympics, in 2003, we were working in China, and we decided, how can we give this thing more, how can we uplift it? The Olympics obviously was on everybody's mind, probably one of the most important events in China, certainly in our lifetimes, a once-in-a-life opportunity. So we started recruiting Olympic athletes individually to do these messages. And once we started doing one or two, like that Maurice Green was actually the first sort of one we did, it became easier and easier because, first of all, this is a cause I think anybody pretty much in the world can get behind. Secondly, when they saw what the ads looked like, they were like, fantastic, yeah, this is going to be great. And we created, I think, a win-win scenario where for the athletes it's great, for their agents they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to show this to their sponsor, they'll get some more work from this. For the networks it's great because it looks beautiful. And I've even sat with the head of Fox here in the United States and have him look and go, yeah, we'll show these because these look fantastic. And that's created this win-win scenario. We get them out a great deal all over the world. Currently, we're recruiting most of China's Olympic hopefuls. We've just done the gold medal ping pong contender, the dive champion, a weightlifter, various other things. Yao Ming's doing another message for us, a whole host of different stars. And we have been somewhat involved with the Olympic Committee, but I think probably where a lot of organizations have not got anywhere is by getting involved and stuck in that, which frankly is a very bureaucratic system. So instead of going out and working with the athletes initially and directly, then we've gone back to them. So now the Yao Ming ad, for example, is on the Beijing Olympic Committee website. If we'd gone to them and said, shall we do a PSA and things like that, and gone through it, it probably wouldn't have happened. But what we've done is gone out and done it, and then it's come back in again. We also, just looking to the future, we have people interested in using this approach on global warming as well, and using the athletes and the massive distribution network we have now in China and India to get over messages on global warming. As I mentioned, it's the high production values that have got us to places. I'm not aware of another international organisation that's been able to partner with CCTV1, for example, and get messaging out. But we've had a very successful partnership with them, and it's been great.
高超的技术才能拯救老虎。你只需要不使用任何虎制品，携手同心，无限生机。
That's actually still in production. They haven't CGI'd the shotgun pellet there, but they're on the way. As well as distributing through television, there are a whole variety now of different ways to distribute. And again, we're now at the point where people are approaching us and saying, hey, we'd love to show. We just had a video game company that sends games down line to people, come to us and say, can we run your PSAs when we send out our games and things? We have 7,000 taxis now that show, in the back of the taxi, on the little screens, they show Yao Ming's message and things like that. We have video billboards all over, owned by Beijing city government, all over Beijing. And of course, the closer we get to the games, the more and more demand there is for the athletes to be appearing. We have screens in all the major airports now. We just did a deal with a company called Air Media, which has 93% of all air travel in China goes through past their screens, both when they're waiting to get on the plane and on the plane. And we also have that kind of thing going on in India. We've done some billboards as well, and billboards, they're not as effective as television, but this is in Beijing, and from a result of this being up there, we had Sports Illustrated in China approached and said, we'd love to give you 26 pages of free advertising. Thank you very much.
For me, life seems to last an eternity. In reality, if you blink, you can miss it. Millions of sharks are killed for their fins. Sharks are disappearing rapidly. At this rate, they will disappear from our oceans in a blink forever. Please do not eat shark fin soup.
To conclude, we've had a real hard time raising funds for this program, basically because when people usually look at education awareness projects, they think about how we're going to fund this in terms of the airtime and things like that. It's prohibitively expensive. One of the key things we've achieved that I think most people haven't managed to achieve is by getting all the airtime for free, by getting the production done at about 5% of the cost, all as donation. We've basically been able to manage, I think, roughly a $10 to $15 million campaign a year for less than $1 million. So it's all been about the leverage, and it's all about getting in-kind donations as opposed to actual cash money. The association with the Games more and more now is making this attractive to the media. And so, again, as I said, they're coming to us. They help it get us out. So most of the heavy lifting is being done by the media. We've adopted a positive approach the whole way through. And that is, I think, the way to go forward. Being critical sometimes has its time, but the reality is positive reinforcement is positive, and it works. So that's the way we've been working. And we've seen, I think, with a lot of the officials we've been working with, as we've gone, kind of almost a change in their attitude to the issue, that it's not this dull, boring, statistical thing, but actually this is something emotional. It's something that we can all care about and all get involved with. We're still hoping that China can make some grand gestures on these issues before the Games. From a PR point of view, this could be such a winner for China. It's not like a lot of the energy things where there's a huge cost of doing these things. This can be very cheap. And say, for example, if the Chinese government say, we're not going to open tiger farming, that would be big news around the world. The world would thank China for doing it. It's not going to cost the Chinese government anything to do that. And that sort of thing could be fantastic. We talked about, are these things lasting? And I think some of the stuff, there's a certain amount of showcasing going on, and it won't go on. But what we're trying to talk about here is behavioral change in individuals. And I think once people have got the idea that it's not right to consume tiger bone, it's not right to take elephant ivory, you don't go back from that. So it's a kind of once and for all persuasion process. So we think it can be. And I think also what we're doing here is making people question about consumption. And I would posit, people say to me, population is the biggest issue in the world. I'm like, no, consumption is the biggest issue in the world. Population is there, but if we didn't all consume so much, it wouldn't be there. So if we're going to survive on this planet, and if these species are almost like the epitome of the survival, if you wipe out a species, you can't really go any more on overconsumption than that. Hopefully it'll make people think a little bit more about everything else they're doing, about the energy consumption and other things. And the reality is we all have to think about this consumption issue, nowhere more than here in the United States. But in China, people are just adopting now their consumption habits. They're getting used to it. They may end up doing exactly the same as us, in which case I have to say I have to shed a tear, because if we all consume at our rate, we're in a lot of trouble. We've all got to make some steps towards it. And I hope that this might inspire people a little bit to realize that it's a finite planet we're living on. If there's 3,000 tigers left, that's getting pretty close to the end of the game. And then just lastly, we feel this approach would be totally appropriate and totally work for global warming. I think there's two things that global warming needs right now. First of all is an inspirational message to say it is not hopeless. I see so many people saying, oh, well, what does it matter? Whatever I do, China's building 500 power stations. It's not going to happen. But of course, every great journey starts with one step. And if we don't take those first steps, we'll never get there. So we have to inspire people. And secondly, we have to encourage individual action change. And that's exactly what we've been doing with this campaign. And we think it would be very easy to adopt this. We've already got offers from the Chinese government. They're very interested in basically using this to encourage actions to stem global warming as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wow, that was really good.
Okay, yeah, and so I get to manage the Q&A,
right,
if you're obedient. Okay, I've got my interns with the mics. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question, make a comment, and please say your name and affiliation so we know where you're coming from.
Yes, we're being
webcast. And if we're really nice, I bet we can be shown like more of those videos.
Yes.
If you're really nice. Those of you that stick around close to the end, right? You got a few more there, right? Okay.
And just to add, we are being webcast, so who knows who will be hearing your excellent questions.
Cha Chen, freelance correspondent to Fulgham. How much the technology transfer to China in GE, water and process technology? And to Mr. Knight, you have recruited some Chinese staff person, but as you show, what language used most is not in Chinese. Why do this way?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Want me to quickly answer?
Yeah, answer that last one.
They're all in Chinese. I happen to show you the English versions. Every single one of them is in Chinese, and actually in Mandarin and Cantonese, and very often they're in other languages around the world. So it always, I've just shown you the English versions, that's all.
Because we didn't think you all were kind of up to speed on some of you are pretty good in Chinese, native language and such. Okay, GE.
The question about how much technology transfer, I guess, could be measured in a couple of ways. One, if you were to look back 5 years ago, we had zero in-country development people. We now have about 52 or so research scientists, PhDs in Shanghai at our research center. Just the fact that GE has built and continues to staff a very large research center, our China Technology Center. Overall, I think, gosh, I wish I knew how many. I think there's 900 or so scientists overall at the Technology Center for GE. Again, the water business has a major center there for us. About 30% of our global resources are in China now for a couple of reasons. One, the need. We have to develop local technologies that take care of the local issue. Our wastewater center of excellence for the world is in China. A lot of our manufacturing centers of excellence, development of a lot of our biocide and biological control technologies are all there in China in order to help alleviate the problem that is there. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for us that's been a significant shift in U.S.-based technology development to China. And that's where the future is for us.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay. How many technology centers are there?
There's 4 major technology centers for all of GE. One in Niskayuna, New York, one in Shanghai, one in Bangalore, and one in Munich. And those, the way that GE research works is we have some fundamental centers of that do development for all of our businesses. For instance, our nanotechnology development is a couple hundred scientists all working across the board looking at 10, 15 years out. And then the businesses tap into that and kind of take some of that research and then develop it for our own businesses. And then each business, like our business, has about 300 researchers around the world, including in China, that are very much focused on developing for our business.
Okay. Well, I was wondering because they don't have that many of these, so one's in China.
It is. It's a biggie.
A biggie.
And
in Pudong, right?
Yep,
Shanghai,
exactly.
Pudong. Okay, some other questions, comments? Right there in the middle.
Hi, my name is Isabella Notar. I'm an Asian history professor at Mount St. Mary's University. And Jennifer, to follow up on your last comment concerning local governments obeying central level policy, and Peter, you also commented about local level behavior to follow suit. I wonder if either one of you knows about how much involvement do local level officials have in the formation of central level environmental policy?
I think that in general, it is still very much a top-down system. But we are seeing that, I think that in the last 10 years, in the environment sphere, I'm seeing a lot more that the central government, sometimes they pass very vague laws. In all sectors, but in the environment, they can be very vague. And it's kind of a call to seeing if there's some experimentation. And we do see that there is some bottom-up stuff where you have certain local governments that take the initiative on issues. I'm just speaking more generally here, but in general, the issue is that local governments have the economic power in China. Economic reforms are successful in China because Deng Xiaoping decentralized power to the local government, and they then are able to just protect their local economies. There's not sufficient transparency for local officials, but some of this is starting to change. And what I see is that in the environmental sphere, there's international organizations working in China. Yours is different. You're more public, but there are a lot of U.S. green groups and NRDC, for example, doing energy projects, working with bringing California and Jiangsu governments together to do demand-side management for energy efficiency. I'm seeing a lot more of the international NGOs and World Bank type entities really trying to engage the local governments to inform them, because to help shift the incentives, but also to shine more of a light on them. So, but in general, it's top down, but they're working on workaround solutions. That's why the Chinese government has, empowered, for example, citizens. They've allowed Chinese grassroots groups to exist. Since 1994, we started seeing green groups registering. They're the first civil society group in China, and to date, there's only been 2 who've been arrested, which over 19. Do your math. It's not too bad, but unfortunately, those arrests are recent, and they tend to be local governments arrest them because they stepped over the line on pollution issues. Lake Tai, there's Wu Lihong, who is now in prison for 3 years. A gentleman in Zhejiang province was trying to create an NGO called, what a good China Watch. Gee, I wonder what they're going to do. He was going to try to monitor what was happening with instances where local people, the farmers, their areas, there's polluted. What can they do? And so, you create an organization that's trying to shine transparency on local government, you're asking for trouble. But the fact that, we are seeing some NGOs trying this and pushing the envelope. So, I know. I will stop because, of course, I will talk all day on this topic. So, some other...
Yeah, no, I think most of the wildlife policy all of it is set centrally, but the implementation of it is done locally. And obviously, this is a particular issue for southern China, much more than northern China. And a lot of it ultimately depends on the enforcement efforts. And there was definitely a vast improvement after SARS. And I think, I'm not sure if people have started to forget that now, but if you think, I can't imagine a worse scenario for China than if there was another SARS outbreak before the Olympics. And so the idea of having wildlife trade going on, which they identified as the vector, seems to me to be crazy. So, I think the implementation in a place like Guangzhou is more important from local entities, but it has to come from the top, as I think everything does in China, really.
Yeah. Okay. Some other right here, Peter.
I'm Peter Kern from the University of Montana, and I have a question for Peter. I was very intrigued by the connection that you made at the end between your campaign and global warming, and especially the discussions that you had about the importance of consumption. Most of the studies that have been done on consumption behavior indicate it's a very complex thing to change. And general appeals don't seem to work as well as appeals that are made where there's some kind of a personal interest in it as well. So, for example, I think one of the more powerful ones, especially in China, is to link the kind of consumption change that you're interested in with health. It seems to me that that's easier to do in the case of global warming than it is in the case of wildlife protection. How would you respond to that?
I wouldn't. The last bit I would is just, I'm not sure that's true, because I've just been interviewing a couple of people on mercury levels in sharks. And sharks bioaccumulate, they're top of the food chain, they get very high doses, and I just found out yesterday something I didn't know, but shark fin is mostly protein, and protein is what the mercury binds to. So we found over a third of shark fin in China has WHO mercury levels higher than they should be. So I think you're right, and I think if I was doing a global warming campaign, and we were just talking about this earlier, one of the things I would concentrate on something very, very specific, like change that light bulb, save yourself money, and very specific rather than a general thing. But I do think there's also a need for a general sense of people that, the inspirational message, the, we can fight them on the beaches type Churchill thing, to actually say, hey, we can do this. Don't just have the apathy. And I think that's to set an atmosphere, not just for individuals, but also for policymakers. And then I think you need very specific recommendations on how to do it. And as you say, how does it benefit me? Well, change a light bulb, save yourself money over the long run on your electricity, and help your family breathe better. Ultimately, we're going to save, if we all do this tomorrow, I mean, God knows what the effects of every single person in China changed one light bulb. The effect, I mean, it's probably like 2 power stations come offline or something, maybe even more than that. So I think you can very directly relate it back into that. And I think there's great prospect for that in little steps. You can't take on the whole thing, but little bits and pieces of very specific behavioral change, which get people into the mindset of thinking, hey, we can do something about it, and feeling good and feeling cool about doing it. Because part of what we're trying to do here is say, wildlife trade's not cool. So action for global warming is cool. Your heroes are doing it. Your heroes want to do that and aspire to it.
Good. Other questions and comments out there? Right there.
Hi, my name is Pema, and I'm a corporate attorney. This is a question for primarily for Jennifer. Sort of how optimistic are you that China can live up to its environmental promises in time for the Olympics? And to your knowledge, how optimistic are the environmental NGOs? And I guess I'm asking this because China's made several promises in regard to the Olympics. For instance, it's promised greater free speech, particularly for foreign media. And just this past summer, we saw them clamp down on a protest by Reporters Without Borders, and they kicked out a small group of Tibetan protesters. So when it comes to the environment, how do we know that China will honor its promises?
Well, actually, can I expand that a bit? Because something that actually, when I was talking to Elizabeth Economy about, we were talking about this issue recently. She was actually initially supposed to come. Sorry about the bait and switch thing. There was an issue that happened. She couldn't make it down. But that in some ways that, from when you're looking at the Olympics, that the Chinese, the outward discussions, the foreign ministry and stuff, they're not really as concerned about the environment. Like the head of Communist Party official in Beijing says, like, the air will be fine for the Olympics. We've got other things to do. And the issue of, security for the games, they're pretty concerned about the Darfur campaign, about linking that to the Olympics, and, will the Falun Gong do something? And again, getting the stadiums built, those seem to be kind of higher up on the agenda, because in some ways, my feeling is that they feel like they've done as much as they can in terms of the policies, the technology that they've bought from you guys and other entities but again, there's this they're kind of backtracking on the use of, extreme measures to close everything down so the air is clean. And I think because they realize that there's opposition to that. Factories are not going to want to close down. So it's hard for me to say. I think that again, the air is much better than it was 10 years ago. I was, Peter's there more often. It's definitely much better, but for those of you that have never been to Beijing, you're going to want to run screaming into the night. It's just because to be not to be flippant, but it's true that it still is not great. And again, but the big driver, pun intended, is cars. And again, this is a personal, a lot of these are personal choices. Some say though that actually after SARS in Beijing, car purchases increased massively because no one would be stuck next to the metro of someone who might have SARS. So, so again, this is a personal choice issue, and I think that I have a feeling though that for the Olympics that the test that they had last month was just a test, and so maybe people weren't as inclined to get as excited, but we could see additional pressure. We're going to see, there's also the cloud seeding stuff. So I guess I'm basically answering you by not answering your question. That's saying that it is hard to say. Again, that there's a chance, again, because the IOC is saying that they are now thinking practically on postponing the endurance things. And so that looks like that's getting more likely. How is that for answering, not answering? Okay. And you can do more.
A little bit. I think they'll meet some of them and not others, is the reality. And I think they set some very ambitious goals. And I think I was amazed how ambitious their goals were, quite frankly. And there's no way, I know we're working in a totally different situation here, but I don't see us setting many goals like that and getting 90% of the way there. I think we have to remember that. So I think some of them they'll make and some of them they won't. But I think what's important is they're starting to think about it as an economic issue, as a health issue, but also in saving money and being energy efficient, and also that, that skip technology where you don't go through a terrestrial phone system, you go straight to cell phones because it's cheaper. And I think that's one of the major, probably long-term gains, is just a focus and attitude to think about these things in that longer-term way. And I have to say, I mean, I don't see us doing a lot of that in here, and that's disappointing, I'm afraid, but the reality, I think.
Let me add one more thing, is that also another thing that when they were making their goals for Beijing, I think one thing that they weren't necessarily thinking enough regionally, and that just here's a nice stat, not to overwhelm you. In 2000, the government estimated that they would double their coal consumption by 2020. They did it this year already, you guys, by 2007. So that in some ways they had these goals, and they've done a lot of they've done a lot of the investment. They've got 90% of their buses switched over, 70% of taxis. They met these goals, but in some ways the economic growth went a lot faster than they expected, and that coal, 70% of their energy comes from that. So, but again, that's why I think that, they're very pragmatic. Again, we'll see what happens if, there may be some more draconian measures last minute. Again, there's going to be a gamble, but they've got a lot of balls in the air around the Olympics.
Yeah, just one
one
more point on that. I think a couple of things that we're seeing, which are positive and negative influences. One is this just the rising middle class. I mean, that we're going to have a billion, or 100 million. I can't even keep track of all the numbers. There's so many statistics flying around.
250 now, another 250 in
another 250
10,
by
years.
10 years. But again, that's accelerating beyond what the original projections were in 2000. So that rising class with more money has more demands, and those demands typically result in more energy consumption, larger housing, all of those things that we take for granted. Which is working against, which is one of the reasons why coal consumption's up, and a lot of the power demand is beyond what even the expectations were 10 years ago. On the positive side of that, there's been a recent study. In fact, we had a group from one of our suppliers from Europe was with you this morning in our offices in Philadelphia, and they just completed a study, a B2C study, looking at consumers of electrical goods. And very positive trend in China is that the consumer this new consumer, this rising middle class, is demanding energy efficiency, demanding a long-term approach rather than just price. And that's very different. 5 or 10 years ago, it was all about price. So what we're seeing is they care about that, whether it's Energy Star, those type of things in their appliances, in their bulbs. So I think while we're seeing that rising demand, the purchases that they're making or the decisions they're making are going to drive the right behavior. It's just, where does it crash?
Okay, some other questions or comments? We're getting them out now. But I'm going to go to others first before I go back for seconds. This gentleman in the middle, and then the woman in pinkish. Red. Maroon.
Hi, I'm Andrew Oros. I teach Asian politics at Washington College. I think all of your talks were extremely impressive, and I've learned a lot, and it's also very inspirational. So I don't mean to bring a downer, but it's sort of a follow-up. It's sort of a follow-up to the questions that the comments you just raised. I mean, despite this progress, do you think it's enough? It seems to me that Elizabeth Economy doesn't seem to think it's enough, and there's quite a number of people who have this sense that there's going to be just sort of economic collapse in China because of the scale of environmental problems. And I was actually going to raise the issue that you just raised yourself about coal production, for example. I mean, at the time of planning the Olympics, it seems like they expected to be at a cleaner place than they're at now because they had bought technology from GE and others to get the air cleaner, but actually things are moving ahead so quickly, which is good for China in some ways. But I just wonder, if you think of the Al Gore scenario of global warming, I mean, he also doesn't think that incremental steps, the first steps of a journey is enough, that we have to dramatically change our pattern. So it doesn't undermine any of the work that you're doing, but I wonder if thinking beyond the work you're doing, do you think other people need to be doing other work that somehow does things much more dramatically than the incremental progress you're making?
Let me start. You want to come down the row here?
Sure. It depends what morning you catch me on. If you catch me on the wrong morning, the whole world's going to hell with a handbag. I don't think any country in the world is really doing enough on global warming, my personal opinion. And I think my personal opinion is we've got to lead the way, frankly. So we're talking about China today, but I think it would be nice if we did some examples. And we're not, and our leadership is not doing that. But I think psychologically, you have to start to try and do it in little bits and pieces, and I think we're moving in the right direction. I mean, I think that what's happened, and I'm talking globally now, not just in China, the perception of global warming over the last 18 months to 2 years has totally changed. You have Bush mentioning it, you have people now basically accepting it's happening. We weren't at that stage a few years ago. So that, to me, it's been a major mind change. And I think it's been a major mind change to all things environmental. It wasn't that long ago, almost every type of environmentalist, even people doing something as apolitical as we were doing, were branded as loony hippies, and there you go. So the answer to the question is basically, no, it's not enough. Is China any more to blame than anywhere else? I personally don't think so. I think we've had our lifestyle changes. We've produced our carbon. There's a lot fewer of us. But so on a bad morning, I'm pessimistic. On a good morning, I'm optimistic. Because if we ever do get to that point of a big change, I think the only thing that would make something like that happen is things like Katrina, major disasters, which really make people think, oh my God, this is absolutely urgent. That may or may not happen, and our danger is death by 1,000 cuts, in that we don't see this as enough of a profile. So, I mean, in some ways, you almost hope like something that would happen to wake everybody up, because we're not getting there right now. But we have the seeds of people's minds thinking in the right direction. So if something like that happens, they'll be ready to start accepting the lifestyle changes we're going to have to make, which ultimately, the reason those things aren't happening is they're not politically acceptable at this time. Not in China and not here, and particularly not here, and in Europe, places like that. So, I think I'm optimistic on the one hand that it started. I'm totally think that none of this is happening quick enough. And I look at my 2-year-old daughter and I think, what on earth are you going to inherit? And I feel very sad about that. But I think we've got to start somewhere. We've made a start.
I think you made a point earlier, Peter, about that it's tied to economics. And I think we're not to that tipping point yet, but I think that China is going to have some severe economic impact, and we're seeing it in bits and pieces, and that's what's going to drive the right behavior and drive a much broader sweeping moves. I think that what we are seeing is the demand by producers driving back into the supply chain and making changes and demanding change in that supply chain. That didn't happen even 5 years ago. So I think that the changes can be sweeping and push both directions, for instance, from a supply chain standpoint. Healthcare costs, as we look at the tie to economics to healthcare, and that the direct correlations are made, the economic drivers are going to really drive different behaviors than what we see today. But are we doing enough? Absolutely not. It's headed the right direction. Didn't get here quickly, and the problem ain't going to be solved quickly. The very positive thing that I'm seeing is it's like if this was a continuous curve and almost a logarithmically downwards curve, we're seeing a flattening out and improvement in many, many areas. And eventually, water issues, air issues, and all, they cannot sustain the current situation. I mean, you cannot continue to steel demand alone. You can't continue to produce steel with crappy water. I mean, so it's those kind of. So it reaches a point where the economics will drive the right behaviors, because you cannot continue down this path. It's non-sustainable.
Okay, they did some of the good points I wanted, but I've something to add. A little different. I mean, obviously, today we're talking about the Olympics. The Olympics can't be the silver green bullet, right, to solve China's environmental problems. I did comment that, yes, it's been a major awareness raising. Ultimately, yes, there's the economic issue, but for China, there's the political issue. I mean, the Communist Party had a report in the mid-1990s. It was probably secret, and then everyone knows about it now. But that when you're looking at the three major drivers of what could cause instability in China, they said lack of economic growth, corruption, and environmental degradation. These three are linked. I mean, the magnitude of China's environmental problems is huge. And you probably think me insane that I can, my job is 24/7 China's environment, and I still remain optimistic. Part of it is because I do come in contact with a lot of what I call the China's eco-entrepreneurs in the government, the NGO, the business, the research sector. I've got great folks like these coming to talk. But I think that, the Chinese government is very pragmatic. They have made a lot of changes. They're at a tipping point. There's the political tipping point now. Can we rein in the local governments? And it's not just on environment. There are many other sectors where Beijing wants to get control of what the local governments are doing. But there's also the issue of protests, social instability. China's EPA said in 2005 there were 50,000 protests on environment. A number from China. Must be more. A lot of those are rural-based, sometimes linked to land grabs. But I don't know if any of you were aware, early June in Xiamen, coastal city in Fujian province. Go home, Google Xiamen YouTube Xiamen protest. Hit return. In Xiamen, the government, again following the not very well following the environmental impact assessment law, had done an environmental impact assessment, no public hearing, on a chemical plant to be located near the city center. Some students at Xiamen University found out about it. Using text messaging alone, they were able to get about 10,000 people out on the streets early June, obviously probably scaring the bejeebies out of some officials throughout the country. It was peaceful, but the idea that the environment is something that could cause more conflict. Again, you have to think the environmental problems, look at it in the bigger context of other problems that China's having. But that it is a threat to the economy. And so, stay tuned. It's a race. China's lead water activist Ma Jun has said China has 10 years. They've got a window. It's closing. They're going to have to really do some really amazing things, more amazing things than they have. They have these amazing policies. Implement them. Let's see what's going to happen. A few more major chemical spills. So I remain positive. Some other questions the woman with the shirt that we've been evaluating.
My name is Morgan Ashenfelder from the Scripps Howard Foundation Wire.
Can you hold it close to your...
Yes. And my question is primarily for Jennifer Turner. You mentioned that propaganda will play a long-term effect in the future after the Olympics. So I was just wondering what role propaganda will play, particularly in regard to environmental regulations.
Well, I think that, again, it's crystal ball, just kind of looking. But again, the idea that when you look at there have been studies. I thought that WildAid, you guys focused on the animal study, but the fact, also keep in mind, they actually did a survey in China of that many people. That stuff didn't happen 10 years ago, you guys. You couldn't go around knocking on doors. I know you probably had Chinese. I'd like to know in a moment how you guys did that. But there are other surveys. Chinese organizations, universities are doing surveys of public opinion, and they are seeing more and more that people are caring. And we're starting to see maybe more sophisticated surveys that, people care, but are they willing to pay? And the awareness raising that's happening through, again, you just saw WildAid focused on the animal issue, but there are a lot of other organizations in China that are working to raise the public's awareness. And again, I can't tell you exactly how that's going to pan out, but the fact that we see the increasing number of protests, urbanites organizing themselves, 10,000 people on a capital, major city in China about one chemical plant. Again, these are just anecdotal indications, but we track the news on my website on what's being reported in China on the environment. And what I've seen in the last few years, the amount of reporting in the Chinese press is gone up phenomenally. The amount of transparency, the fact that they report that 2 villages in Gansu had 1,000 people, mainly children, who suffered from lead poisoning from a smelter. They published that. Years back you couldn't. Yes, and there have been constraints on journalists, of course. Now journalists do have to check with their editors before they report on an environmental accident. But there's, I don't know. I can't go any further in predicting. Help me out here. Your survey, can you say real quick about how you did that?
We did it in conjunction with Agongo, basically.
Government-organized NGO.
Yeah, so that was the one way of doing it. I just wanted to pick up on your point, is that I've met with very senior Chinese government officials, and their line is, you mentioned those 3 areas they were worried about, the corruption things. Environmental degradation is number 1 as the potential source for political unrest. Not ideology or anything like that, but actually grassroots environmental problems. And so this is a major, major issue. And I think the other thing which is different in China from many other countries is the government can and does take a very long-term view. And so those are the optimistic sides. Are they all the way they need to be? No, of course they're not. No government in the world is. But I think there are reasons for some optimism. One of the things, again, is people talk about the Chinese government controlling everything, but they don't control everything. Local government is incredibly powerful, and central government doesn't always have control over that. So I think the propaganda ultimately, or education propaganda, whatever you want to term it, but is very important, because ultimately you are going to be relying on individuals locally to actually want to do these things and to want to be involved in it. So I think it'll play an increasing role. I think there's signs that the Chinese government has sometimes let go on journalism and then pulled back in and let go, but I think the long-term trend is definitely to allowing more. And I think there's been a high-level decision that environment is a legitimate thing to talk about, which maybe, political side isn't. So that, I think, is encouraging too.
Okay, we had another question. It was somewhere over here. Remind me, the woman right there. Sorry.
Hi, Lisa Delpy Narati, Professor of Sports Management at George Washington University, and I've had the opportunity to attend 13 Olympic Games consecutive since 1984. And I bring students over and we study the games, and we've looked at all the environmental efforts.
Will you come talk to me after you go to Beijing? I'd love to know.
My question is more targeted for Jeff and perhaps Peter, in terms of using that Olympic spirit during the games, and you know, we've already talked about raising awareness through your public, you know, your press releases going out about what GE's doing and all that. But what are you doing at the games? I know in Torino they started using message boards, video boards, to send out messages about UNESCO. In Torino, that was the first time that they started sending out public messages, and I would think that you're going to be doing some hands-on. And I'm hoping that you're not just doing it at the games in Beijing, but are you working with the U.S. Olympic Committee, other national Olympic committees, to use their athletes like Peter's doing in China to spread the word and maybe get spectators to sign a pledge, like the Olympic athletes take an oath to be, you know,
to be
healthy,
green.
yes. But maybe you can get the spectators to sign on being to go back and spread the word and be more conservative and green.
There's multiple activities and a lot unplanned, some that are not defined yet completely. But our goal is not just to be about the Beijing Olympics, be all about China, and then absolutely utilize the Olympic athletes as spokespeople. Some of the things I'm not going to be able to share today, and quite frankly, not unlike the Chinese government, we're focused right now on building a stadium and doing a lot of the project work, and behind the scenes working actually with our advertising agencies and others, and our NBCU business, developing what that will be. So seeing how we're just short of a year away, we have not defined everything we're doing. We've got more ideas than we have the ability to implement. But I think, you know, your ideas are great, and I would love to hear if you know, any other interesting ideas that we would adapt. But I'm not up to speed enough to be able to share with you today everything that we are doing.
But there is going to be, there's at the Olympic itself, there's actually going to be some kind of a demonstration technology booth.
We've got a very large footprint in the Olympic Green, so it'll be demonstration of many of these technologies. And actually, a lot of things like our wastewater treatment plant is a visitor center, is, you know, translucent wall. You can, you know, see a lot of it is exposure to what are these best available technologies. The village system that I mentioned, our kind of milk run thing we're doing for villages, that's going to be on display at the Olympics with video showing the before and afters of those communities. So things like that, but we want to be able to do more than just at the games. It's really reaching beyond that and using that as a platform to be able to show the good that is being done and to try to accelerate to the other communities in China and around the world to be able to, you can do this too. And it's small steps, but it's also some major steps in change. As we look at these megacities that are going to be built over the next, you know, the 26 new megacities in the next 20 years or so, we can do those differently. Water-wise, we don't need to have, you know, thousands of miles of underground piping to leak. City of Chicago, we're losing 60% of the water that's produced never makes it to the end user. It leaks in the ground. It's wonderful. You're replenishing the aquifers with clean water, but it's kind of expensive to do it that way. So we can look at distributed water systems and those type of things in China and other places. So we're going to use that as a platform to be able to show what could be. How do we look at 2025 or 2050 and prevent the future from happening as it looks right now? So we're going to do that in a lot of different ways, and of course having NBCU as part of our fleet of businesses certainly helps us be able to get that word out. So stay tuned. If I were to do this 3 months from now, I think I'd have a more detailed story for you.
I think I'm going to have to do a post-Olympic.
Yeah,
we got to talk, maybe post-Olympic meeting, like what, so that I could answer, because we can actually be able to say, what did happen at the Olympics? How was the air?
I got to talk to Jeff about supplying you with some PSAs, but ironically enough, well, first of all, the International Olympic Committee is somewhat famed for being labyrinthine and extremely difficult to deal with unless you put 6-7 figures on the table. So we have not really dealt with the International Olympic Committee, and the irony is the Beijing Olympic Committee is already showing our messages at all the stadiums around the place, but when it comes to the games, they don't control it. The International Olympic Committee controls it. So I hope that we are able to maybe get in some dialogue with the International Committee, and I'm not sure if that means going to Geneva or what, but we are not sure what we'll be doing at the actual games. At the build-up and all around, we'll be doing lots of stuff. At the actual games, it remains to be seen. I suspect that most of it is probably airtime's all sold and things like that, so we'll see. But on the pledge idea, we've started that. We haven't had really much finance to be able to promote it. We've got people like Yao Ming that have signed on, and it's the Global Pledge for Wildlife. And the original idea was to try and get as many people from all different parts of the world and present it to either president or premier just before the games. And we haven't got very far, as I say, because we basically haven't got the means to promote it right now. But we do have a relationship with like Sina.com, which is one of the major people out there, one of the major internet providers. And the other thing we've got is great connections in India. So our thinking behind it was, we haven't got much time left now, but was to try and if we could hit India and China in a big way, the potential for a very large number of signatures is out there. And using the internet, that might be the way to do it. But I think our main program is going to be up and around, and whether we can actually get the support of the International Olympic Committee doing this at the time, I don't know yet. Hasn't been our priority, because our priority has been getting out as far and wide in China as we can, which we've been quite successful at doing.
Okay, question right here in the center. Sarah, if you can help me out there.
Hi, my name is Ming Yang. And
can you hold it straight?
Okay, my name is Ming Yang Jam from the National Endowment for Democracy, and I work on China, so I'm very glad to hear that there is all this optimism regarding the Olympics and the environment. But I did want to offer a different point of view, and I wanted to see if the panelists could comment on this, which is there was a talk at the Carnegie Endowment yesterday on the 17th National Party Congress, and one of the points raised by Ming Xinpei, who is a very famous Chinese critic, is that if the government were very serious about the environment, which all of you seems to suggest, it would establish an environmental working group to deal with these issues, as it does with Tibet, with Taiwan, with corruption. So issues that are obviously long-term and the Chinese government seriously cares about. So I was wondering, do you know of any of this, either political moves to establish such a group or to have some sort of just a group of people that manage these policies? And also one very short question to Peter Knight. Do you have any mechanisms to study, for example, the actual impact in terms of maybe people buying less shark fins, and what are the follow-ups to that? Because that would be very interesting to know. Thank you.
Why don't you go first, because yours is
okay,
easier.
that might be easy. Yeah, the idea was we did the pre-survey so we could do the post to analyse the differences. We've done this in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Thailand previously, and we got the results on shark fin soup specifically, and the results between 8 and 30% people saying they stopped eating it altogether, and that another 40% or so said they would eat it less, and then much bigger increases in awareness levels as well. So our intention would be to do it afterwards. The other indicator we usually have from the shark fin traders is how much they dislike us, and they disliked us enough in Thailand to sue for $4 million and didn't win, but they've been making the same kind of noises. Yao Ming stood up and said he wasn't going to eat shark fin soup anymore, and that generated a lot of media, and they came out of the woodwork at that point. And
especially when he stands up.
Well, exactly. So, yes, in other words, we'll measure it by both that, and also by government action as well. So since we've started this campaign, the government has announced they're going to protect 3 shark species, which is a start. And they also made noises about potentially monitoring the shark fin trade, which would be massive. I mean, they could China's in that unique position that if they monitor the shark fin trade, we would know pretty much what's going on with sharks all around the world. So we're hoping for that. On the other area, I don't really know enough about how it works to whether they should set up an environment working group. If you look at the progress that's happened on Tibet and Taiwan, you might say you don't want them to set up an environmental working group, I'd say. But I think what's more interesting is how this environment is penetrating all the different ministries within China. And whether there needs to be a formal unit, I don't know enough about the infrastructure to comment on, really.
I won't bore you with the political science side of me, but I mean, should note that it's true, because when I said my focus, I was focusing mainly on the Olympics with my lens today, and that, but when you look in terms of the institutions, I mean, China's EPA has 300 people. I mean, they've got research arms that make it about 1,000. That's not very many. We have 18,000 in our EPA, just the federal system. Just in D.C. is 9,000, but they're underfunded, so understaffed. But one thing that, again, I neglected to mention during my talk was that I really think partially linked to the Olympics was that this push for China to create regional EPA offices. Our EPA is helping them to set up 6 regional offices. They're being funded by the Asia Development Bank. I don't know why they're not being funded by China, but their big issue is that driving this is air. The first office to set up was in Beijing, and this is a very good sign. And again, it's you can be Liz Economy, we're yin and yang on this issue. She's a little bit more negative. I'm a little more positive, but I think that when you look at some of the signs, also like besides SEPA, kind of flexing their muscle more, closing down plants because they haven't done an EIA. Okay, they open back up a little while later, but they're getting a lot more press. They did a giant survey of chemical plants in China, and were able, they published, they said, of the 21,000 plants, half of them are near water, drinking water sources on the Yangtze and the Yellow River. I mean, they are actually publishing the nasty news, and so I think that, again, that's a positive trend. But one that's more concrete, the National Development Reform Commission, they're the big guys, right? The planners. They don't plan anymore. They reform. They came out and supported SEPA's green GDP plan that has been going back and forth for a couple of years. The idea of a green GDP is that you would evaluate local officials on their environmental performance. Well, even though NDRC supported this, they had a pilot going, and in March, all of the local governments, all the provinces withdrew, because when you actually looked at their green GDP, they were all black. And they couldn't have that. It's like, but the idea that the province, the power of the local government, and in some ways I think just another working group isn't going to do it. I mean, I think that, again, pushing for the innovative policies, but also, again, giving, they need to also loosen up regulations on registering NGOs. That stuff has to open up even more. There's a lot of more political reforms that need to happen. Create a donations law so people can actually donate to groups and get tax. I could talk your ear off about there are many necessary political reforms that need to go on to make the environmental protection better. But then when you step back and look at a lot of progressive trends in China in terms of the civil society and the law rulemaking, it's happening in the environmental sphere. Other questions or comments in the back row? Danye.
Hi, my name is Dan Yi. I'm a business attorney in DC, and I have a question for Peter. You mentioned about using animal product for consumption and for medicine in China. Like a lot of the product, like tiger's bones and rhino's horns, are used in medicine, and I want to know: is there any studies on the demographic of people who consume the medicine? Because I was in China, recently in both urban and rural China, and it seemed that in urban China, where people has more access to modern Western healthcare, they're much less reliant on the traditional or more like superstitious, belief that, let's say, you eat rhino's horn, you can balance your yin and yang. Whereas while I was living in rural China, it seems like, the people without, where the nearest hospital is like 25 miles away, are much more reliant on, traditional medicine, which often use precious endangered animals. So I just want to know if there's any systematic study on this.
I'm not sure there's been a systematic study, but the reality is that the wildlife consumption for medicine is very much usually the older generation, first of all. And secondly, I think what you'd find is 99.999% of traditional medicine is herbal and other stuff, rather than the high-end animals like the tigers. I mean, there's so few tigers left in the world now that the people that consume tiger bone are very few and far between, and they're mainly in cities, frankly, because those are the people that are wealthy enough to. The bulk of traditional medicine is herbal, and that's where you find it's much more rural, and it's the lower end of the market, if you like. So the other aspect, which is the consumption for things like that for food, which is probably more worrying now at this point, because the traditional medicine, the practitioners now pretty much said, we don't need tiger bone, we don't need rhino horn. And it's ironic now that it's actually some officials from the government and the owners of the tiger farms that are pushing this tiger farm thing. The medicine people are saying, we don't need it. We've got other things we can use. We don't need it. So I think most of our stuff, as you see, is reaching the urban audience. That's the audience that has the money as well. And the top-end endangered species, it's definitely those people with the affluence that are buying it. And most of the rural population, it's traditional medicine that is the lower-end, cheaper stuff. So those people are perhaps less worrying in terms of endangered species. And this is the whole thing about endangered species everywhere in the world. It's things like the bushmeat in Africa. The local people in Africa are usually consuming the antelope and the lower-end things. The gorillas and the chimpanzees using the bushmeat trade are being shipped into the cities because those are the people who can afford it. There's almost a natural limit, as if you're hunting something, it becomes very rare. You know, it's not worth hunting it as much as other things. Whereas if you have this high-end trade and it's worth 10 times the amount, then obviously it's worth hunting it to a much greater degree towards extinction.
Okay. So, Diane in the back?
I am a researcher in DC. I just want to mention something that is related to that latest question. If I'm right, I think the one international working group was set up by the Foreign Ministry. I think the group is headed by the current Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi. And a similar group was set up by the State Council, and Wen Jiabo is the head of the group. So, if I'm right, just don't mention that.
Yeah, well, no, that's good to know. But in some ways, those aren't. But that's probably more for high level. But that's a good sign. I mean, I think that. But you know, there's also an omission, like in China's Go West campaign to develop Western China. SIPA's not on that working group. Yeah. Okay. And right there in the back row, Sarah.
Carrie Frontero with Gensler Architecture Firm. I was actually have a question for Jeff. You had mentioned you had a photo of the new stadium.
I was just trying to nudge him like.
I was going to wonder if we could see it.
And actually, yeah, we work quite a bit with Gensler, who is doing a tremendous amount everywhere to drive toward LEED certification, toward much more acceptable green building standards. So we applaud Gensler, Turner, a lot of the more progressive companies, because you know, as we talk about change, incremental change or massive change, I think it takes change in many areas, and so I just applaud the work that Gensler's doing.
Okay, we'll see this, and then
I've been with GE almost 23 years. I was asked to come here to Beijing to help start up the Beijing Olympic team.
Sorry, go back to the beginning.
Beautiful, bold, clearly unique. And when you get close, you see this lattice network of all the steel on the outside, and you're peering in, you're trying to figure out what's going on inside of the structure. It's just simply a beautiful work of art and unmatched, unparalleled in the world. My name is Greg Madden. I've been with GE almost 23 years. I was asked to come here to Beijing to help start up the Beijing Olympic team. Really focused on my portion, the building of the stadiums, and trying to bring as many GE products and services as we can to all the venue owners of the stadiums. We're standing in the National Stadium in Beijing, located on the Olympic Green, the north end of the city. If you draw a direct line south from here, you look at Tiananmen and the Forbidden City. The actual physical site selection of this location is very critical because, you know, hundreds of years ago, when the emperor was sitting in the Forbidden City and looking north, he had a direct line of sight to this spot. So there's historical significance to it, and it's very, very strong. Our participation here at the National Stadium started off early on working with the owners, the biggest system being the electrical power system, and also different elements of the security system like fire alarm, fire safety. In addition to that, obviously all the lighting. And staying in touch with the designer, Herzog and de Meuron's requirements for lighting that blends into the structure. The Olympics is something that really binds communities together. We're all living on this small planet together. We all have to respect each other and the planet we live on. The only word to describe it is proud. I mean, proud to be a part of the GE team, proud to be involved in all the good work that's been done here.
Pretty cool looking stadium.
So it's
This
called
was kind of internal. It wasn't quite as flashy as the others. These are kind of to share what we're doing internally within the business, but it's exciting projects for sure.
It's called the Bird's Nest, the stadium?
For obvious reasons.
For obvious reasons.
Everybody ate bird's nest.
Bird's nest soup. Okay, I guess last question or comment. But thank you for saying that, because I was sitting there like, show the video, show the video. Yeah.
Xiaoxuan again, since Peter mentioned change light bulb, I have to ask Jeff a question. Do you know what the GE has done in about light bulb in China?
Well, it's one of those start small and grow big. In fact, I was looking through some of my notes. I was getting some information from our consumer and industrial business on the impact of light bulbs, and so allow me to go to my notes, because let's see what we had. A couple of things going on. Roadway lighting, we've got 20% energy savings during low traffic flow hours, during a 33-kilometer highway and a bridge. So a lot of it is being replaced. Compact fluorescents are used in the lighting of choice for, just a small example, one of the big JW Marriott that's going in, it makes rooms 20% brighter and 80% more energy efficient. Right now, the C&I business said that there's over 100 venues now that are all going to all compact fluorescent, 100% throughout, or other versions of low energy lighting. We're also experimenting with some new LED lighting and other much lower energy and higher output. The equivalent of a 16-watt, energy drain for 100-watt output of light, if you want to think of it that way. So throughout at least the Beijing venues, it's going strong. What we are seeing is an adoption of the much more high efficiency lighting throughout the country, not just around the Beijing Olympics. So we want to continue to drive that behavior. Again, I think what we're seeing is a change in the buying behavior of the citizen in China, not looking at just initial acquisition costs. It's a little more expensive to buy that CFL, but they're thinking about it in the long term. How does it impact me? How does it impact the environment? And a long-term cost savings. So, have you replaced them at home? You have them in your house yet? We can all talk about China, but one of the things that's interesting today is what are we doing?
Yeah.
Are we still driving our 15-mile-a-gallon car, or just about water? What's interesting is people are more willing to pay more for their cable bill today than they are their water bill. We think of it's our right to pure water, but we need to think differently if we're ever going to change things. So. Not that $3 gas is a good thing, but sometimes a little more expensive will drive some of the right behaviors.
Okay, well, right